It began not with an army marching across continents, nor with the roar of cannons echoing through foreign skies, but with a single sheet of parchment laid flat beneath the dim glow of a candle, as a hand dipped its quill into ink and quietly began to conquer the world. No one heard the sound of empires collapsing that night, because they didn't collapse, they were rewritten. Britain discovered something far more enduring than gunpowder. It found a weapon that never rusted, never rebelled, and never slept: the contract. While the rest of Europe fought over borders, Britain learned to own them, through credit, debt, and paper. The true British Empire was not a fleet of ships or a wall of muskets. It was an invisible architecture of belief, a system of signatures, seals, and promises that convinced nations to hand over their wealth willingly. It was conquered not by taking, but by convincing, and it all began in silence. The 17th century birthed a new order, not of kings and knights, but of clerks and capital. From the narrow streets of London emerged a new kind of power, men in powdered wigs drafting agreements that could outlive dynasties. A few drops of ink could alter ownership, dictate trade, and transform distant lands into obedient markets. Among the most dangerous of these creations was a company, the East India Company, a business so vast, so unrestrained, that it blurred the line between commerce and conquest. It was not a nation, yet it ruled one. It had no crown, yet it wielded more authority than monarchs, and it was born from the same ink that would one day drown half the world in debt. A royal charter, signed in calm civility, gave it power over millions who never saw the document that decided their fate. That's how Britain learned that domination didn't require violence. It only required language. Every signature became a command. Every treaty became a chain. In the colonies, people worked. In London, paper moved. And as long as the paper flowed, so did the wealth. Upward, inward, homeward. India's cotton, Africa's gold, China's tea, all traveled through invisible corridors of obligation. What was once extracted by soldiers was now extracted by bankers. This was not a war of conquest. It was a war of consent, carefully engineered by those who understood that numbers could enslave faster than armies. Even rebellion was profitable. If a colony rose up, Britain lent it money to rebuild, then owned its debt forever. That was the brilliance and the cruelty of the ink. It didn't just sign agreements. It rewrote dependency. Behind every polite negotiation stood a ledger. Behind every partnership, a trap. And behind every British victory, a nation that never realized it had been defeated, until it began paying interest. Empires of the sword fall when the blood dries. Empires of paper endure, because their chains are invisible and self-imposed. By the 19th century, Britain's reach had become spectral, not seen, only felt. The pound sterling and the bond certificate replaced the bayonet and the cannon. And from its quiet offices along the Thames, clerks could move more wealth in a day than entire armies could seize in a year. That was the new order of conquest. A war where ink was bloodless, yet far more permanent. Because when you rule by belief, not by fear, your power doesn't end with surrender. It continues through trust. And trust, once commodified, becomes the most valuable resource of all. So Britain perfected the art of turning trust into tribute, trade into obedience, and cooperation into control. It taught the world that enslavement could be dressed as opportunity, and that the signature of a merchant could hold more power than the seal of a king. The colonies sent goods, Britain sent paper, and somehow the paper was worth more. That is how an empire hid its conquest in plain sight, behind ledgers, laws, and letters. While others conquered land, Britain conquered value itself. The ink dried centuries ago, but its mark never faded, because that was the moment humanity crossed a line it could never uncross. The moment when power no longer needed armies, when the future could be owned with nothing but confidence, illusion, and a signature. And from that day on, the world would learn a truth it still hasn't forgotten, that the most dangerous weapon ever created was not made of metal, it was made of paper. The ink had done its work. What began as paper contracts soon evolved into something far more powerful, a financial machinery so vast that it could move the world without ever lifting a sword. The British Empire no longer needed to conquer land. It simply needed to control credit. Debt became its new army. At the heart of this invisible conquest stood an institution that looked harmless enough, the Bank of England. When it was founded in 1694, few could imagine that this modest building would one day become the most influential fortress on earth. Its weapon wasn't gold, but confidence. Its soldiers were not men in uniform, but clerks behind ledgers. And its battlefield stretched across every port, mine, and market tied to the British crown. the bank introduced a revolutionary idea that a promise to pay could be more valuable than payment itself. With every note it printed, Britain expanded not its territory, but its reach. The paper currency, backed by royal authority, became a silent command. Wherever this note circulates, British power circulates with it. The beauty and the danger of this system was that it created dependence. Nations that traded with Britain needed British credit. Colonies that wanted infrastructure needed British loans. And once they accepted the currency, they also accepted the rules that came with it. That was the genius of Britain's empire. It convinced others to participate in their own subjugation. While the sun never set on its flag, it also never set on its balance sheets. The empire had mastered perpetual motion, interest. Every loan made abroad meant profits flowing home. Every repayment built wealth for London's investors, who reinvested it into new colonies, new monopolies, new wars funded by the very debt those wars created. It was a cycle that turned suffering into dividends. In India, the East India Company didn't just export goods, it exported liquidity. Taxes paid by farmers in Bengal funded the interest payments that enriched shareholders in London. When famine struck, relief funds were debated not by governors, but by accountants. A starving population was, to the empire, an economic calculation, and it wasn't limited to Asia. Across Africa and the Caribbean, Britain perfected the art of extraction through obligation. Slave labor built the sugar fortunes that were later freed through loans, debts that the colonies themselves were forced to repay long after the chains were gone. Freedom, it turned out, came with interest. Britain understood something fundamental about human psychology, that debt creates loyalty deeper than fear. A debtor doesn't rebel, he rationalizes. He believes repayment is a moral duty, not servitude. That illusion gave the empire what no army could: voluntary obedience. But perhaps the most extraordinary evolution of this system came in the 19th century, when the empire's financial web became global. The City of London emerged as the beating heart of international finance. Railways, mines, and governments from Buenos Aires to Bombay depended on British bonds. The same ink that once signed treaties now signed debt securities, and those pieces of paper carried more influence than entire fleets. If a country defaulted, Britain didn't need to invade. Its investors would simply seize assets, ports, or customs revenues, perfectly legal, perfectly civilized, and perfectly devastating. Power was no longer measured in territory, but in exposure. The empire owned not land, but liabilities. It owned the future. That's why, by the dawn of the 20th century, the British pound wasn't just currency, it was command. Every major trade route, from the tea of Ceylon to the oil of the Middle East, was priced and settled in sterling. Britain's influence had become incorporeal, invisible yet omnipresent, like gravity. Even its rivals relied on the very system that empowered it. When nations borrowed to compete, they reinforced the empire they sought to escape. The Bank of England stood above politics, above geography, a silent empire in itself, governing through arithmetic. And this wasn't merely economics, it was belief, an engineered faith in the sanctity of paper. The empire understood that if enough people trusted the system, it would never need to reveal what backed it, because what backed it wasn't gold, it was the world's submission to the idea that gold no longer mattered. Under this illusion, London became the center of global finance, where invisible strings controlled visible nations. And while revolutions toppled kings and flags changed on every continent, the empire of debt remained untouched, for it was not an empire you could overthrow, it was one you lived inside. The ink had built something stronger than walls: dependency. By the early 1900s, even after colonies declared independence, their economies remained tied to British banks, their currencies pegged to the pound, their trade dependent on British insurance, freight, and finance. Freedom existed on paper, but paper was the cage. That's the quiet perfection of the empire's design. It taught the world that domination could wear a suit, speak softly, and arrive with a handshake. It didn't need guns anymore. The signatures were enough. And as the century turned, Britain's financial model spread like a religion, its faith carried forward not by monarchs, but by markets. What began with the East India Company's ledger became the blueprint for a new global order, one where nations would no longer be conquered, they would simply be indebted. Centuries have passed since the first British charter was signed in candlelight. Yet the empire it created never truly vanished. It simply changed form, shedding flags, colonies, and crowns, until all that remained was the one thing it had always cared about most: control through credit. Today, That control doesn't wear a crown. It wears a logo. It doesn't speak through monarchs. It speaks through markets. And its capital isn't London alone. It's wherever the numbers live. The empire of paper didn't die. It globalized. After Britain's power began to fade, its architecture of influence didn't collapse. It was inherited. The banking systems, trade laws, and debt mechanisms that once built the empire were reassembled into new institutions: the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and later the US dollar system that still rules the world today. They didn't conquer nations, they stabilized them. They didn't seize wealth, they managed it. But beneath those gentle words lies the same equation Britain discovered long ago. Whoever controls credit controls destiny. The forms changed, the essence did not. The British pound gave birth to the global dollar. The East India Company's trade monopolies evolved into multinational corporations. The colonial governors were replaced by boards and shareholders, yet their reach extends farther than any empire could dream. Now decisions that shape billions of lives are made not in palaces or parliaments, but in conference rooms, where the air smells of polished glass and hidden power. The ink may have dried, but its descendants still flow through the arteries of global finance, through interest rates, stock indexes, and algorithms that never sleep. And just like before, it all depends on belief. Belief in the promise that the paper still means something. Belief that the system is fair, that the money is real, that the balance is stable. But belief is fragile, because if history taught us anything, it's that paper empires always end the same way: quietly, then suddenly. The East India Company fell under its own corruption. The gold standard collapsed under its own lies. And yet every collapse gives birth to a new illusion, more sophisticated, more digital, more detached from anything tangible. Today the ink has become code, the contract has become an algorithm, the empire has become invisible. When you swipe a card, take a loan, or accept the terms of an app without reading them, you are in a small way continuing the ritual that began centuries ago in those dim British chambers, the ritual of trust in systems you do not control. This is not a condemnation, it's an observation, because no civilization can function without belief, but every civilization collapses when belief becomes blind. And so the question returns: if ink built the old world, what will build or destroy the next? History whispers its answer. The tools may change, but the logic remains. The empire of debt never ended. It merely went digital. Its currency is data, its colonies are consumers, and its rulers are the algorithms deciding who gets credit, who gets silence, and who gets left behind. The paper that once bore the king's signature has become an invisible signature we give every day when we click accept. But beneath the complexity, the old truth still lingers. Real wealth is not in currency, but in control. Control of minds, markets, and meaning. And as long as humanity believes that value is something that can be printed, priced, or programmed, there will always be those who hold the pen and those who are written about, because the empire of paper was never just British, it was human, and it still rules us, one transaction at a time. If you've reached this point, if you've followed the ink trail from past to present, then you already know why this story matters. The patterns of history are not dead, they're disguised, and the only real defense against manipulation is awareness. So before you close this video, take a moment to think about every signature, every loan, every digital approval you give without a thought, because that is where empires are rebuilt today. And if you want more truths like this, stories that reveal how power hides behind systems and how history's ripples still move the modern world, then help this message reach more eyes. Like the video, share it forward, and subscribe to Financial Ripples,